But freedom of expression is not unlimited. For example, it's not allowed to cry fire in a packed cinema.
Canada, how are we? Welcome back to This Week in Canada. I'm Nico Johnson. I'm the political editor here at the Post Millennial. And today we have with us it's Matthew Grainger. Matthew, who the bloody hell are you?
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, Nico. My name's Matthew. I regularly host the Canada Explained segment on the Post Millennial YouTube channel. Last time I was on the podcast, I was introduced as not Nico. So I'm very happy to be not Roberto this time around. And last time I was described as someone very much more attractive than Nico. And I think you guys will finally have the proof to back up those claims. So I'm excited. How are you, Nico?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Although I had a rather strange date, in part due to my lack of attractiveness. And as a result of that, I had a date with a girl. She was British, and she had sort of mangled teeth and sort of bleeding yellow gums. I thought it'd be quite useful. We're about to go into lockdown where I live, so I thought it'd be quite useful to have a sort of companion to suffer through that with. But nevertheless, we went to this cocktail bar, and it was awful, just zero chemistry. Like really, really bad conversation. One of the worst dates I've ever been on. And at the end, her friends came in to just leave me isolated on the table, just sort of looking at this conversation. It was a disaster. But I was thinking, and it's very similar to the position Justin Trudeau is in right now. He's watching François Legault, the Premier of Quebec, have this wonderful conversation with Emmanuel Macron, who's the President of France, all because he's an incredibly weak leader. Now, allow me to provide you some context. Over the last few weeks, France has been sort of in deep diplomatic hot water with Turkish nations, and this has to do with his plan to combat radical Islam. And France really has a bad Islam problem. And adding fuel to the flames, Charlie Hebdo sort of did a satirical cover of Erdogan. Charlie Hebdo, you may remember, is the magazine that drew the Prophet Muhammad, and like a bunch of people, journalists, were murdered by terrorists in France. This is like in 2016, really horrible stuff. And a teacher in France showed his students this portrait as an exhibition of what it is to be like satirical, just perfectly harmless stuff. And what happened is he got beheaded. And then a day later, we saw 3 people get murdered in a church in I think it was Nice. It was like really gruesome stuff. And obviously, everyone condemned these attacks. Freedom of expression is one of the most important freedoms we have. It allows us to think. It is vital to our democracy. And naturally, all across the Western world, people came out, even India came out and said, you should have every right to draw the Prophet Muhammad, except one, and that's Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau said that freedom of expression has limits, and he went further and said drawing the Prophet Muhammad as a cartoon is a bit like yelling fire in a movie theatre. Now, this is just another example of the Canadian Prime Minister embarrassing his country on the world stage. I mean, I felt embarrassed speaking to my international friends. It was awful. But it's not the first time Justin Trudeau's embarrassed himself totally like this on the world stage, is it?
No, absolutely not. He's done it multiple times. He was wearing a traditional Indian wedding dress to a regular business casual meeting. And when he met with a Bollywood star, he was wearing a gold encrusted dress, and the Bollywood star was wearing a business suit. It's been ridiculous. He has these gaffes over and over again, but I think this is the most damaging instance of a Trudeau gaffe we've seen in a very long time, almost comparable to blackface. And the comparison between a elementary school teacher speaking to their students, holding a conversation about freedom of speech, and then promptly being murdered because of it is in no way comparable to yelling fire in a movie theater. I don't know why he used that parallel. You would expect a Canadian Prime Minister to stand there and be unequivocal in their support of freedom of speech, but he wasn't at the very moment when he was asked. And it seems like he's sort of changed his mind. He's changing tact. Maybe he saw that the poll numbers for that particular statement weren't very good. But I think it makes you realize how far the Liberal Party has come when Erin O'Toole has to stand up in Canadian Parliament and tell Justin Trudeau and repeat a quote from his own father about upholding freedom of speech in order to get the point across.
Certain political rights are inseparable from the very essence of democracy. Freedom of thought, speech, expression, assembly, and association. Can the Prime Minister tell us whose quote that is?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we will always defend political rights, Canadians' rights, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, all the rights Canadians expect Canadian governments to defend, we will always defend.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Today, Mr. Speaker, but not on Friday. That quote was the Prime Minister's father in a book published.
I think it's ridiculous that the Liberal Party is noodling with the idea of freedom of speech. And all irony, I accept. I get the irony in this statement. But in Canada, I don't think freedom of speech should be up for debate.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. It was disgusting. And it showed, I think, a good point you made, actually, that this guy is incredibly weak. He goes by poll numbers. And in this particular instance, he tried to have it both ways. He tried to say, to appease everyone. And what happened is that he just threw one of our most essential values totally under the bus in name of poll numbers, and hopefully it backfired a bit. But this has real-world repercussions. The Quebecois, and I know we complain a lot about the Quebecois, and they are, they're a bit selfish sometimes, and they ask a bit too much, and God, do they complain. But it's Canada, and I care about keeping this country together. And when you have Emmanuel Macron go and interact with François Legault, and he's not a separatist, but he has a lot of ex-separatists in the party, and I can foresee him supporting a separatist movement. And when you have, Yves François Blanchet using this as ammunition, literally a separatist, then he's throwing our very confederation at stake, not only our values, but the country itself. It was hugely embarrassing, and I hope he gets proper a lambasting as a result of this. But then again, Canadians love voting Trudeau, so he probably won't. But oh well.
Absolutely. No matter how many times he's dissed on the world stage, whether it's a really awkward handshake or a horrible abuse of human rights in this instance, we'll be here to report it. So,
yeah, and you know what? I saw an interesting comment, actually, and it was by a German guy. And again, one of the things that's embarrassing about this is almost the whole civilized world united to condemn Justin Trudeau for this. All of Christendom essentially came together, and not even Christendom, like India, for instance, came out and said, "What are you doing?" And he said, and I think this is totally true, the reason why we have secularism, the reason why we have separation between church and state, the reason why France has incredibly strict secularism is because it protects everyone of all faiths. It allows you to practice your faith so long as you don't infringe on other people, which I think is one of the most wonderful things on earth. And the fact that Justin Trudeau can be equivocal about that, can sort of throw that issue to the wind for the sake of poll numbers, is just classic him. How many times...
And the fact that he's backpedaling on it just shows that he knew he was wrong as soon as he said it. And he knows how Canadians feel about these issues. And this is not the time to be questioning freedom of speech when you just had a literal beheading as a cause of terrorism. I don't get what was going on in his head, if anything.
And with being somewhat critical of Aaron O'Toole on this show, Roberta and I in previous weeks have sort of said, well, we wish he'd be a bit stricter. We wish Pierre Poilievre could teach him a few lessons in shredding his opponent. Pierre Poilievre's brilliant. I saw him make a Liberal minister cry. It was wonderful. But I think for the first time, he actually really stood up and he made a statement both on Facebook or social media and in the House of Commons saying, no, we're not going to be weak on this issue. Canada stands hand in hand with France on this issue against Islamic terrorism or terrorism for all sorts and for freedom of expression. So good on the Conservatives.
Absolutely. And I think Macron made the right call to Legault in this case and making an embarrassment out of Trudeau because he knows that these sorts of public appearances really matter to him. I'm sure his ego will show some cracks in it, but I'm glad that Trudeau has backpedaled and that we can fully support freedom of speech.
Exactly. Wow. What a transition. Those never get old, do they? Well, over the course of a few last 2 days, I know who knew elections could last so long. We've obviously been dealing with the American election. We don't know the results yet. And I have to say, I'm a little bit cautious in commenting on the American election. You know, I do Canadian politics. It's not my right, really, to comment on American elections so much. But, I mean, it's been a bit weird with Canadian politicians also having to deal with that conundrum. And indeed, Matthew sent me a wonderful video of certain politicians just having egg on their face and trying to step around the issue. Matt, what do you think about all this?
Yeah, it's probably the most tumultuous election result. Well, not result. We'll be posting this on Friday. We're recording on Thursday, so we don't know the result yet, or if there will be one by Friday. But it's tumultuous to say the least. And Canadian politicians know that, and they're dancing around the issue in fantastic fashion. And Trudeau, who's the best at circumlocutions, came out and said unequivocally, when asked about the issue of the American election, I have the quote here, it's fantastic. He said, and I quote, "There is an electoral process underway in the United States." And I think he absolutely hit the nail on the head. What do you think, Nico?
Yeah, I know. I mean, leave it to Justin Trudeau to make these enormously enlightening comments. Yeah, well done. And of course, we saw other Conservative politicians just sort of, I don't comment on other elections. Pierre Poilievre, let's roll the clip of Pierre Poilievre.
God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
Wasn't that wonderful? I mean, that's a good way to not comment on something, you know. I wish more politicians were like Pierre Poilievre. I mean, I just love the guy. I think he's great. He's a wonderful family. I hope he becomes Prime Minister one day, but, you know, we'll see.
I absolutely love that he used scripture to get out of the predicament, but I'm slightly concerned that he used the Serenity Prayer, which is notoriously famous for being a part of the 12-part process of AA in the United States. So I'm a little bit worried about Pierre, but I'm also incredibly proud of him for the process, for the progress he's making. So good for Pierre.
Good point. But of course, there was one politician who couldn't help himself, one leader of an increasingly irrelevant political party who just had to make himself the center of attention because, you know, that there's nothing else for him to do, apparently. And that was Jagmeet Singh. Matt, what did Jagmeet Singh say?
It was weird. You know, I don't often praise Trudeau, but as you've been continually saying, it's not our business to weigh in on American presidential elections, especially one as controversial as this. And as much as Trudeau made a very vacuous comment with no real meaning, that was just a statement of fact, Jagmeet Singh is setting a dangerous precedent where he says that we should be supporting a certain outcome, that we should be, and the Prime Minister should be, denouncing Trump and weighing in on an electoral result that we don't know yet. And I think that's exceptionally dangerous.
So not only is Jagmeet Singh throwing all diplomatic protocol to the winds with this one, he's also, well, he accused Trump of being a racist. He said America's never been more unequal. Perhaps there's points to that. I don't know. I'm not going to weigh in, not going to touch that with a barge pole. However, he said that Trump was incompetent. And you know what? That's his opinion. But coming from Jagmeet Singh, I mean, let's remember, this is the guy who almost single-handedly brought the NDP from a 100-seat party. You know, Jack Layton a few years ago, obviously Mulcair came in between them, but Jack Layton was the opposition leader. He controlled Quebec. And under Jagmeet Singh, he's lost all of those seats. He's also, bear in mind, thrown the party into total abject poverty. I mean, the NDP are so poor that they've basically become sort of, you know, vassals for the Liberal Party. The reason why we can't have an election is because Jagmeet Singh shut down the We Committee because he's too poor. They'd lose everything. You have an increasingly competent Green Party leader, Anime Paul. I don't know how to pronounce his first name. We have a Conservative Party that I hope will come for Canada's working class because, you know, I think they are doing well in that regard. And we have an increasingly left-wing Liberal Party, which means Jagmeet Singh, this corpse, you know, with his Rolexes and $1,000 suits and BMW, basically the only way to get attention is to make these ridiculous statements about countries that he has no business talking about. It's really irritating.
Yeah, his bid for prime minister so far has been showing to everyone in the Canadian public that he's prime ministerial and would make ridiculous comments on the state of diplomatic affairs, and continues to just lay down in the face of Trudeau's political plays and just avoid elections at all costs because he can't afford one. And all of his policies have been appropriated by the Liberals. So at this point, the NDP is a shell of its former financial self, a shell of its former ideological self, and no longer has a strong leader that really commands respect. As much as Jagmeet Singh is a nice guy, he really hasn't proven to anyone that he could hold the office.
I don't know if he's a nice guy. I think, he you know what he did, which really irritated me, and actually we talked about this last week. When he was running in Burnaby South, remember how he didn't have a seat in the House of Commons for a year because he's totally incompetent? The Green Party, and again, I'm not particularly keen on the Greens. I particularly hate Elizabeth May. I think she's a total walrus. But the Green Party did the NDP a favour of not standing a candidate against a leader. It's parliamentary protocol. It's what you do, it's what people have done for generations. And yet, when it was Anna May Paul's turn, the Green Party leader, whose name I still can't pronounce, to run in Toronto Centre, he stood a candidate against her because he, I guess, needs the money or he needs the attention, and that's just pretty dishonest.
I think he just needs the seats. How many seats does he have now? Less than 20.
It's in the 20s, I think.
Yeah. Brutal performance by Jagmeet Singh.
It's totally brutal. And, I find what they did with the We Charity to be a bit despicable. I mean, God, let's not beat the We Charity scandal to death, but I'll bring it up one more time. The We Charity scandal, it was down to Pierre Poilievre. It was down to Michael Barrett, who's a wonderful Conservative guy who I hope has a future in the party. And it was Charlie Angus of the NDP, who really, prodded and provoked the Liberals. And through those three and some journalists, we discovered just how weird and salacious the We deal was. And yet, when it actually came to it, when we said, well, let's set up an anti-corruption committee, people like Charlie Angus, people like Jagmeet Singh, who have been just virtue signalling the entire time, just threw it to the wind. They don't care. All they care about is getting seats which they won't win. They're a plague on Canadian democracy. I hope they get just eradicated in the next election. I mean, fingers crossed. And yeah, I think that's pretty much all I have to say on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And if Jagmeet Singh continues to be leader, I have full confidence, as you said, that they will be eradicated in the next election.
Well, here's hoping. It was just gorgeous. Those never get old. Although I would like to see some more transitions. James is really lazy, and basically he just sits on his laptop all day, drinking bottles of wine, and eventually perhaps we can stir him from his slumber and get him to make another cool transition. But I know we said we wouldn't talk about the presidential election, and we're not going to. We're going to talk how it applies to Canada. I think that's what we're here to do, really.
Absolutely.
You don't care about our opinions on who's a better president. But Matthew, you are focusing this week. You're making a video. Why don't you explain that?
Yeah. So as a part of the Canada Explained segment this week, we took a turn and focused on how a Biden presidency might affect Canadians. And the reality of the situation is we will always feel the effects of American president, regardless of who they are or what they enact. As Pierre Elliott Trudeau once put it, being in a relationship with the United States is like sleeping with an elephant. You'll always feel its twitches. And in the case of Biden, one of the forefront issues for Canadians should be the Keystone XL pipeline. Biden has created this idea of the green energy revolution, as he's called it, which includes rejoining the Paris Accord. And as much as he bashes tariffs, he even has suggested that if countries don't meet their Paris Accord targets, he would impose carbon tariffs, another form of carbon tax, but on other countries. And finally, he's even promised to end the Keystone XL pipeline. You might know it as the Trans Mountain pipeline, or simply the pipeline that got Via Rail shut down for a month and didn't let you move across the country. But
I remember that. Yeah,
it was brutal. I was trapped in Toronto. I couldn't go home, and it was brutal. But anyways, Biden has said that he would end construction of the Keystone pipeline. And for Albertans, I can't think of anything more devastating. The oil sector in Alberta is already struggling. We've been through years of debate over the Keystone Pipeline. I think we're verging on 5 full years of Trudeau wavering, promising support, not promising support, trying to tread that balance like he did with free speech. And this could spell the end for the Keystone Pipeline. Among other things, there's also NATO, which in recent years under President Trump, Canada has seen a real push to meet that 2% membership requirement that we've been failing to meet. And I see that as reasonable. We've sort of been slacking in that area. But Biden's commitments to forging new alliances, especially with democratic countries, will probably apply to NATO as well, and we'll likely see a stronger push to ramp up our military spending and possibly even see greater deployments. So that's sort of the rundown on how a Biden presidency could affect Canadians. Nico, what do you think on the matter? Is Biden going to have that big of an impact?
Well, I suspect he probably will. It'd obviously be an enormous shame about the pipeline. God willing that gets built. I didn't sort of get stuck in Montreal for 2 weeks not to have this bloody pipeline built. But, I also find the NATO stuff particularly interesting. We signed up for something, we signed up for a deal. And part of the promises that we made was to have 2% of the GDP, I think, spent on our military. And here's the thing. Look, I spend a lot of time abroad, particularly in Europe. Canadians don't understand, or perhaps you do, maybe you do. You guys don't understand how much the world loves you. Canada is known for being friendly, just wonderful partners and allies. And it's good for both Canada and the world to have a strong Canadian military. We can stand up, probably not under Justin Trudeau, but when we get a Conservative Prime Minister in, for things like freedom of speech. We can make sure that our other allies are protected, and we can do our part in an agreement. So I think, Trump's a controversial president, obviously, but his calls to have NATO countries spend 2%, I thought was totally reasonable.
Absolutely. And Trudeau in the past, we brokered a deal to get used F-16s from Australia in order to replenish our Air Force, even though they were vastly out of date, and Australia was getting rid of them because they apparently didn't work anymore or as much as they liked, and they were buying new equipment. But Canada continually refuses to invest in our military, even to meet the requirements of NATO, which I think is one of the most important alliances we're a part of. And to see Trudeau waver on these issues, it might actually be good for him to get a little push from any American president to start reinvesting in our military and signifying to the rest of the world that we're not stepping back from foreign affairs.
Well, if I may play devil's advocate, I think, a Trump presidency isn't all rosy, tinted celebrations for Canada. That's not really an expression, but we'll plow on anyway. Of course, Trump's new NAFTA deal, I think it's called USMCA, which is a bit of a mouthful, that's hurt Canadian industry, hasn't it? But it's not as though Biden's going to repeal that, will he?
Well, Biden seemed to make a part of his rhetoric getting rid of all tariffs, and then he went along and promised to put tariffs on countries who weren't abiding by the Paris Accord. So as much as we already know what a Trump presidency looks like, that's why we haven't spent much time explaining it. We've felt the impact of a Trump presidency. A Biden presidency is a reality we haven't faced yet, and the possibilities are much different than that under Trump. But I think we could see tariffs under Biden as much as we see them under Trump, just in a different area.
Well, you know what I'm even more worried about? I'm just dreading the day Kamala Harris comes to Ottawa for the progressive photo shoot. I don't know what's going to happen, but Justin Trudeau, leader of the woke world, standing hand in hand with Kamala. I forget how you say it. Kamala. Oh yeah. Shit, Kamala. Yeah,
no
standing in
swearing,
line
Nico.
You I know. I'm sorry. But no, it's so that's going to be dreadful. Again, don't want to comment, but my God, I don't like sort of social justicey people, no matter what country they come from. And Kamala Harris, for me, seems to sort of symbolize everything that is wrong with the Democrat Party. Like she has the bad traits of a conservative, like when she was Attorney General of California and locked up people for 10 years for cannabis possessions. And then she has, on the other side, all the worst parts of sort of a left-wing person. You know, she released a video on Twitter, I think the day before the election commenced, basically endorsing equality of outcome. You know, like, this is pretty radical stuff. So I don't know.
I was hearing American news commentators talk about how this was the first woman ever to be second on a presidential ticket. And I thought, have you ever heard NBA commenters try to make up new achievements for Kobe Bryant? Like, it was the first time in history that someone has gotten exactly 11 assists and 13 3-points and something like that. They're just coming up with new achievements to give someone. And I think Kamala Harris is a product of that. And her effect on the ticket is so minimal. We've seen it in the past.
Well, she's so unpopular. I mean, I don't know why Democrats think she's going to be some anecdote to their woes. I mean, we remember the primaries. And even with Democrats, she was so unpopular that she pulled out before a vote could even boot her out of the bloody competition.
And remember, her number one opponent throughout the entire thing, she was plastered all over news outlets for absolutely slamming Biden on a day-to-day basis in every debate. And then they come out 2 weeks later like they've been the best of friends this whole time, see eye to eye, and somehow Kamala Harris is the natural successor of the Democratic Party is pretty astonishing.
Yeah, and I mean, look, Joe Biden, you say what you will, but he's pretty old. I mean, there's a chance here that Kamala, I think that's how you say it, will become president, not just in the second term, but possibly even the first term. We don't know how long Joe Biden
Nico,
has.
if I was a betting man, and I am, because I have bet on this matter, the odds for Kamala Harris are 201 to 1. So if you want to make some easy money and you don't have any faith in Biden's longevity, I suggest you put down $20, $50, and even if it's just 20, you could make $2,000 off of a small bet. And I swear I don't work for Bet365 or anything like that, but you can make some serious coinage if you want to.
Well, guys, let me know in the comments. Should I take that bet? Sounds pretty good to me. That was a good segment. Welcome back. Another wonderful transition. This is the end. It's been a good podcast, I think. You know, Roberto is obviously superior in almost every way. You know, looks, intelligence, you know, just charisma. But that's okay. We're doing our best. Hopefully, Roberto will be back next week. And do remember to email us. You know, I really do. I spent like 2 hours today reading emails. I find it so flattering. Thank you so much. Leave a comment, leave a like, and do subscribe. Again, we've been over this. I know how many of you don't subscribe to this channel. Come on, what are you doing? Subscribe, press that button. And Matt, anything to say to the dear viewers?
Well, thank you for having me on again. I know I pale in comparison to the sheer star power of Roberto, and I could never equate or dream to equate to Nico. So I'm humbled to be asked on as a lowly, unintelligent commentator on a regular other podcast. So I really appreciate the viciously unattractive Nico having me on. And I want to hear your thoughts about me in the comments as well, just to fuel my ego if possible.
Perfect. Matt, thank you so much for coming on. Everyone, I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.